Engaging Our Enemies, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. In a speech to a joint session of Congress shortly after the 9/11 attacks, George Bush famously warned that every nation had to choose to either stand with the U.S. or with the terrorists. In the years that followed, those perceived to be on the wrong side were largely given the diplomatic cold shoulder. Many foreign policy practitioners, however, continued to call for dialogue. Recently, the policy of engaging with our adversaries has become an issue in the presidential campaign, as candidates debate the costs and benefits of engagement versus isolation. To help us explore the options for the next American president, we're joined by a foreign policy professional with a distinguished career in public service. Ambassador David Mack served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bush 41 administration, where he directed the conduct of U.S. relations with 12 Middle Eastern governments, including Iran, Iraq, and Syria. He also served as an advisor and instructor at the National War College. Since July 1998, he has served as Vice President of the Washington-based Middle East Institute, focusing on public policy and scholarly programs. Ambassador David Mack, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, I'd like to begin with some sense of what it is we mean sort of officially by an enemy of the U.S. government. There is, of course, the State Department list. I'm wondering if you could mention a bit about who's on the list, how they got there.
Sure. The State Department is, by act of Congress, required to publish a list of states that are deemed to be state supporters of terrorism. And for the most part, those states have been Arab states and plus Iran. However, they have also included, I think from almost the beginning, Cuba, and eventually North Korea was added to the list. The reason why there was such a preponderance of Arab states, I think, had a lot to do with the fact that these are states that had practiced terrorism directed against Israel. And I remember one of the very early heads of counterterrorism at the State Department explaining to me that you get on the terrorism list by attacking either the United States or Israel. If it's a question of Iraq, which at that time was off the list, supporting terrorism against the Iranian government, that's not a concern of ours. Nor, obviously, do we consider a terrorist group like the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka to be an enemy of the United States, even though it's hard to find a more vicious, deadly terrorist organization. They virtually invented in modern times suicide bombing. So I thought that the president, when he spoke before the UN General Assembly in September 2001 and said governments around the world have to take a stand either with us or against, and what he said specifically was with us or against us in the war against terrorism with a global reach. Well, I thought that's interesting. He's obviously giving the Syrians a chance to take a stand with us. He doesn't even seem to be including Hamas, which, to my knowledge, had not attacked the United States. Hezbollah obviously would be included, but then it's been a long time objective of the United States to try to drive a wedge between Hezbollah and Syrian support. So that kind of made a lot of sense to me as a formulation. So I'll confess I was dumbfounded and dismayed when in the President's State of the Union message in January 2004, after we had successfully collaborated with Iran in taking down the Taliban regime. And Iran was even providing some assistance in tracking down al-Qaeda people who were al-Qaeda fighters that were fleeing Iran, and nonetheless, or fleeing Afghanistan. And nonetheless, the president declared an axis of evil including Iraq, Iran, North Korea. Actually, I was holding my breath to hear whether Syria would be on the list or Libya. And I have some friends who deal with the Far East who were dismayed that North Korea was paired. So there is an odd subjective character about who it is that at various times the administration or the U.S. media decides to declare as an enemy of the United States.
And what does that really mean for those states in terms of their dealings with the U.S.? If you're on the list, what happens or what doesn't happen?
Well, if you're on the terrorism list, you're subject to all kinds of prohibitions in terms of U.S. trade, other U.S. contacts, educational exchange. There are a whole lot of unilateral sanctions which are part of being on the terrorism list. And the legislation that sets up sanctions is very often hitched to the question of whether a government is on the list of state supporters of terrorism. It's also become clear over time that it's much easier to place a country on that list than it is to get a country off. And that creates a dilemma, since obviously we want to have policies that will encourage changes in behavior, that might encourage a nation that is an enemy of ours to become only a potential adversary, and eventually even to find areas of cooperation. And if you have a too rigid set of procedures, as we do now, for graduating a country off the terrorism list, it can be a real impediment to getting them to change their behavior.
Well, and I'd like to talk a bit about some historical examples where we have tried to engage with governments that, whether or not they were on the formal list, certainly were largely considered adversaries, beginning with President Nixon's trip to China.
That's right. I mean, one of the real defining factors of the foreign policy of President Nixon, aided and articulated by Secretary Kissinger, then his national security director, but certainly it came out of the strategic thinking of the president himself, who, whatever his faults, was a strategic thinker and a pretty good one.
Well, there was this notion of triangulating.
That's right.
Soviet Union.
He always saw global politics as being a case where you have no permanent enemies or permanent friends, only permanent interests, as he might have expressed it. And you can always gain a certain advantage vis-a-vis the stronger of your adversaries by engaging in some kind of alliance or some kind of diplomatic engagement or economic engagement with another one of your adversaries who also can, for tactical purposes, be the adversary of your real principal enemy.
So as the Arabic proverb says, the enemy of my enemy, if not my friend, is at least a potential strategic ally.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, let's look at something I know you have a great personal connection to, the rehabilitation, if you will, of Libya. And how did that transpire?
Well, Libya makes it for an interesting case. If you look at the long history of U.S.-Libyan relations, starting at the beginning of the 19th century, what we see are brief periods of violence and use of force, beginning with the war between the young United States and the pirates, protected and organized as part of the economy.
At the halls of Tripoli and the Marine Corps hit him.
Absolutely. And there are brief periods of violence like that like attacks on U.S. targets in Europe in 1986 and our bombing of the cities of Tripoli and Benghazi in 1986, and the downing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. You see these brief periods of violence. And then you see certain periods, such as the 50s and 60s and early 70s, when the United States was absolutely instrumental in Libya gaining its political independence from Italian colonialism and in establishing itself as a growing and developing economy, going from one of the poorest nations in the world to one of the ones that had a promising economic future in interaction with the United States, and particularly the role of United States companies. They were very promising periods. But then, for most of the history of those 200 plus years, it's been long periods of neglect. When, in 1992, for reasons we don't fully understand, the head of Libyan intelligence made the first, to me at least, known overture to a former senior State Department official of the Bush 41 administration. They basically wanted to start a dialogue with us then to discuss problems and to see if we could somehow resolve the problems between the two countries. It appears that what happened was that Gaddafi had come to the conclusion that what he had been trying to do in terms of building up Libya as a regional power, in terms of making of himself a global political figure, had not been working. In fact, it had made life more dangerous for Libya. It had made them a target. And instead of giving Libya a chance to develop itself economically and in total independence, it had led to economic stagnation.
Well, I think I'm going to stop you right there. We're going to pick this up after our breaks. Fascinating story. To our viewers, we'll be right back on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with Ambassador David Mack about engaging with our adversaries. Well, you were talking a bit about Gaddafi making a different calculus in the early 90s, that perhaps he needed to try a diplomatic path.
Absolutely. And one of the things I think that had impressed him was that the Bush 41 administration had successfully engineered United Nations sanctions, which were really beginning to hurt. Hurt in the sense that it was isolating Libya from the rest of the international community. It was making it hard for Libyans to travel. And Libyans love to get out of their country and travel. It was also certainly probably not as important as their own economic mismanagement, but it was also causing a lot of economic problems for the Libyan oil industry. So for whatever combination of reasons, he begins this overture. Now, the Bush 41 administration rebuffed him. The last thing that Papa Bush wanted to do going into an election was to have people say that he was cozying up to this mad dictator on the shores of the southern Mediterranean. So he didn't touch that. The Libyans kept trying under the Clinton administration, and at first the Clinton administration also was very cautious, very circumspect about this, as they should have been. But they cautiously began secret talks with the Libyans that proceeded rather successfully. And the Libyans made it very clear that they wanted to put all the issues on the table, including weapons of mass destruction.
Well, and would it be fair to characterize the U.S. position as being very much explicitly around behavioral change rather than regime change?
Oh, absolutely. Regime change had been tried under the Reagan administration, and it had flopped. The Libyan opposition that we were working with proved totally incapable of mounting anything serious. And the only serious challenge to Gaddafi, interestingly enough, has come from some of these Islamist radical movements that have also targeted us more recently. So there was no taste. We'd tried that, it hadn't worked. Gaddafi had tried things, they hadn't worked. So finally, the two sides, with a certain help from the British, from the Saudis, eventually from Nelson Mandela, managed to reach an understanding on ways to deal with the results of Libyan terrorism and to make Libya jump through a certain number of hoops, both in terms of reaching an agreement to compensate the families of the victims and of making specific pledges of turning over Libyans accused of terrorism to an international tribunal that met under the Scottish courts. And this process proceeded, and then, having gotten that out of the way, the Libyans proceeded to also get out of the weapons of mass destruction business and make, in effect, a clean break with a past that had been troubling and obnoxious. How serious a threat it was to the United States. I wouldn't call it an existential threat, but it was a threat certainly to countries closer to Libya, to Italy, to Egypt, to Tunisia, to Israel.
So looking forward then, is there a sort of Libyan model of engagement with people with whom we've had differences?
Well, potentially that was the idea that the people in the State Department were proceeding on. And this was embraced, by the way, after the end of the Clinton administration, by the Bush administration, when they were apprised of what was going on, they took a deep gulp and said, well, that seems to make sense. And so this idea of trying to establish a model of a rogue state that would come in from the cold, that would go from being an enemy, an adversary, to being a state that, despite many, many imperfections, and nobody should doubt that this is a dictatorship, that it has a wretched human rights record, that it has a leader who's capable of saying some very alarming things, even though he seldom backs it up these days with much in the way of deeds. But nonetheless, we could find areas for cooperation. And then
if I could, I'd like to go back then on something you alluded to earlier about, obviously the big case in the news these days, of course, is Iran. Was there not a window when there seemed to be a certain strategic overlap between the interests of the U.S. and the Iranians?
Well, certainly. After September 2001, a number of states, notably for purposes of this discussion, Iran, Syria, Libya, Sudan, made some overtures to the United States. Well, we were desperate to find people who could help us understand the nature of these Islamist radical movements. And, that's not the kind of information, by the way, that we're going to find from Denmark or the Netherlands. And sure enough, we found it very productive to engage in information exchanges and other types of cooperation in a war against some common adversaries. And as it became clear that the Taliban government in Afghanistan, which had been a sworn enemy of the Iranians and had been a big thorn in their side, was not going to deliver Osama bin Laden and other Qaeda leaders to international justice. The Iranians sat down with us along with the Russians, in what's called in the 6+2 context. Iran, Afghanistan's neighbors plus Russia and the United States. And we had very productive collaboration. And people like our present permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, and other senior U.S. diplomats have said that Iranian assistance was absolutely essential in making that effort to overthrow the Taliban successful.
Well, and following on the heels of that, in 2003, there was an overture that was transmitted through the Swiss embassy in Tehran.
The Iranians rather assumed that because we had worked productively on Afghanistan, that we would be willing to do the same thing with regard to Iraq. They knew we had problems with their nuclear plans. They knew we had problems with their views toward the Arab-Israeli dispute and so on. They passed a message in the spring of 2003 saying that they were prepared to meet bilaterally, talk about the whole range of our issues. Now, we had been having meetings on Afghanistan, conducted by the way, by Ryan Crocker, our ambassador in Baghdad, and a young diplomat who had started his diplomatic life in Iran. And those had proceeded well for Afghanistan. The thought was this could be a model for Iraq. But you know, things were going well for us in Iraq, it seemed. The military operations, viewed in strictly military terms, went pretty well.
So mission accomplished.
Well, part of the idea of taking down the Baghdad government was that it would be a base from which there could be various efforts launched that would lead to political change in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, and that the United States could transform the Middle East as part of this.
So why negotiate with someone we can get rid of?
Yeah, and particularly, you know, the view was, well, you know, they're scared, they're coming to us. And so we passed up that opportunity. The tragedy, Doug, of U.S.-Iranian relations over the decades is that when they've been ready to talk to us, we haven't been ready to talk to them, and vice versa. The second term of the Clinton administration, a lot of overtures were made to them, which they rebuffed for various internal domestic political reasons. So it takes two to tango. It's not always Washington's fault by any means. But we did miss a huge opportunity in 2003. Now the Iranians are riding high. They've seen their influence increase in Baghdad as ours declines. They, to a certain extent, are enjoying improving relations all over the Arab world. And so they're beginning to say to themselves, do we really need to have this direct dialogue with the United States? Because a lot of Iranians oppose sitting down and talking to the great Satan.
Well, and that in some ways plays into some of the rhetoric around the current campaign, in which having those kinds of dialogue and engagement is perceived as somehow undermining the U.S. position. How would you characterize those kinds of overtures?
Well, you know, it's always better, it seems to me, to try to combine a strong position militarily, a strong position economically, with diplomatic dialogue. There's simply a huge risk that if you're not using your military within a diplomatic context, it's going to lead to some serious negative, unintended consequences. Just as, frankly, there's problems when you try to practice diplomacy without having a strong deterrent force, if you will, a stick in the closet. Mm-hmm. I've been engaged with both. In my diplomatic career, I was engaged in what I might call toothless diplomacy. The summer of 1990, when April Glaspie and I were trying to talk jawbone the Iraqis out of invading Kuwait. I've been involved with that. I've also been involved in what I would call witless use of force, where we were blowing the tops off mountaintops in Syria and in Lebanon and getting ourselves in a lot of trouble with the Syrians without really having an effective diplomatic strategy in which that use of military force and exposure of our Marines and our diplomats to terrorism made any sense.
Well, we've got under a minute left, so I'll put you in the position of advising the next American president. How do you strike that balance?
Always try to combine a strong military posture with very active and effective diplomacy. That's the first lesson. The other one is have as many allies with you as you can. Do not neglect the United Nations. Do not neglect allies and friends. Increase our leverage in dealing with adversaries by having lots of other people at the table.
Well, Ambassador David Mack, thank you very much for being with us, talking about engaging with our enemies. And to our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,